Again, thanks for being here. So as mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and start off with our first question. It is a two-parter. Let's put it in the chat. So walk us through your relationship with your art. How did you discover your current art form? What about this art form resonates with you? And anyone can answer in any order.
I guess I'll start. Someone's got to do it, right? Yeah, I guess I'll introduce myself first. My name is Lehuauakea. I am a Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiian artist, kakpa maker, and cultural practitioner. And my main focus of my work is the revival of our traditional bark cloth practices, or kapa. And back in the day, that was a very common thing that you not only see for clothing and bedding, but also for ceremonial purposes and just parts from birth to death, everyday life. And so through colonization, that practice was really minimized within our communities and almost eradicated entirely and replaced with modern Western textiles. And so a large pillar of my work is to bring that back into common practice, not just for my family line, but for my larger community. And I fell into this work because when I was in college, doing my last couple years there, I realized that there was a void in my work. And I went to school in Portland, which is demographically the whitest city in the so-called United States. And I think the college demographics also kind of reflect that. And so I felt like part of me needed to assimilate, and the other part of me felt like I was killing my spirit to do so. And so I started remembering the things that I learned as a child, growing up back home in Hawaii. And part of that was the patterns that we'd use to tell stories on kapa or bark cloth. And that kind of opened a whole new universe into what I do now. And my primary kumu, or my primary teacher, is the same individual that my grandmother babysat as a teenager about 60 years ago. And he's a master practitioner nowadays. And so, small world, right? I think also our teachers appear when the student is ready. And I was finally able to go back home and learn, because I was finally at that place in my own journey to learn from our elders, and for this very very amazing practice. And so that's kind of how I fell into what I do now. So mahalo.
I'll go next. Mahalo nui. Thank you. Shikoli, Cat Brown Akootchook, Niyokyats. My name is Katrina Brown Akootchook, or Cat Brown Akootchook. I'm Oneida Nation of the Thames, which is formerly around northern New York, and now we've been pushed into Canada. But it's like a border tribe. We've been bisected. There's a whole bunch of us in Wisconsin too. I've fallen into a lot of different art forms, and so it's really hard to pin down just one. But I think that's sort of like just part of my creative journey and my sort of reclamation of sort of recognizing Indigenous art, and my approach to Indigenous art as just like this sort of an adventure in process, and like learning the processes again and finding the things that used to be so common for us. So my journey began with like reclaiming beadwork. And then I started sort of learning more and more about beadwork and wanting to work with traditional hides. And so by reclaiming the process, I've learned how to start tanning my own hides using methods that were just, again, day to day in the home for everyone. And it was just something part of our everyday. And so just sort of pursuing these mixtures of the modern and the traditional and blending them together with sort of an understanding of where I sit in the legacy of colonialism and also Indigenous joy, like bringing it all together. It's just sort of a big mixed bag, but it's a lot of fun. And I think it's a lot of healing work that I've managed to do through that. So yeah, that's my sort of basics. Thank you, Jaco.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. My name is, well, my Indigenous name is Kweponi Siwa, and that's what I'd like to go by. My pronouns are she, her, hers, ella, and I come from the Chichimeca Zacateca community. I live in Iowa, so it's been interesting to live here in this state, being far away from the motherland, but my form of art is writing. I feel like, especially growing up, like there was no representation about people that looked like me, people who had my experiences, and having to sit through a classroom and not feel seen or represented was really hard for me. So I started this journey as a form of therapy. Actually, my therapist told me that I should write, and I discovered that I actually felt like it was very healing for me, and she encouraged me to publish, and I would submit my work in random journals and places where you could get published, and eventually I was finally able to get published in a book. So it's been amazing, but I've also realized that oftentimes like people will decide what they want you to write, and they want you to make it white, basically, like for a white audience is what I'm trying to say. Like, you know, I applied for a fellowship, and then I got kind of accepted to that, but I felt like the people in charge were controlling the entire thing. And it, as much as like they wanted to say, oh, this is your story, it's your voice, it wasn't really my voice, because there were a lot of things that were erased in the editing process. So as in the future, I'm working right now on creating a nonprofit where we can do our own fellowships, where we don't have white people telling us what to write or how to write it, because my story is my story. And if y'all don't understand it, well, too bad, you know, but that's my art piece. So yeah.
I can go next. Carlito, my name is Benjy Russell. I'm a Choctaw artist, originally from rural Oklahoma. I've lived in rural Tennessee for the last 14 years on stolen Yuchi land. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a self-taught artist, so I had to kind of teach myself over the years how it works. I mainly work in photography, but I also work in sculpture and video as well. I've been doing construction work since I was in high school. So I would take all my paychecks and buy film for my camera and try to figure out how it works, how to manipulate it. And then after that, I started on a course of slowly learning what it means to make meaningful and conceptual photo-based artwork. I use mainly in-camera techniques, which means I don't use Photoshop. A lot of my work has elements of magical realism and surrealism baked into it. So it's a bit of a conundrum whenever you see something that looks like it should be impossible, but since everything is in camera, it's this moment of magical realism that actually happens. So it's a bit documentarian for these moments of magic that can happen. Yeah, so that's me and my practice.
I can follow. Osio, my name is Heather. I use she, they pronouns, and I am Chisagi, or the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. I grew up in eastern part of Kentucky and now live in eastern Tennessee. And so same as Kat, when Kat was speaking, I was like, man, felt that, where it was like so many different art practices. So I grew up with my Indigenous grandparents, and from when I was young, my grandmother would teach me how to sew and how to start beading, and would ingrain that while also having my white side of the family work in art museums. And so started me with art really young and impressionable in that. And so have kind of felt through everything, gone through painting, gone through like clay art, and have found my way back to sewing and crocheting. And so kind of like mixing a little bit of realms, while also still doing a lot of beadwork when I was in undergrad in our grad school program with our Native American Student Association. It was just something we would all come together and do and just unwind and have community with. And so kind of how sewing and crocheting just resonate with me. It's like honoring my grandmother and my mom, who would like from birth, like would sew clothes and sew our skirts and sew different things. And then also with crocheting, it's like my form of, okay, like I can zone out from like all of my current things going on, because I'm like, oh, there's so much, and I can focus on making different things and making different pieces, and kind of culminating everything into one. So it's a little bit about my journey. She's chaotic, but it's me. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. I appreciated learning more about you all and the art you all do. Alrighty, so for our next question, you can interpret any question however you would like, whatever makes sense for you. But what does Native American and indigeneity mean and look like for you?
I guess I'll start again. We can just keep that order if that works, or I don't know, maybe we're all introverts here too. That's totally what the vibe feels like. Totally fine. I guess, yeah, for me, I don't, just speaking on my own experience, I don't use the term Native American to identify, also because Native Hawaiians are also excluded from that kind of bubble. There's like Alaska Native, Native American, and Native Hawaiian, and all of those things are very colonial and politically informed and driven labels that serve to divide us rather than help us and unify us. And so there's that, and also the fact that Native Hawaiians are not federally recognized, even though Hawaii was illegally annexed by the United States, and we are indigenous peoples of those lands. So by definition, we are Native American, but I don't necessarily think that label is helpful for me or my people. On the other hand, indigeneity is something that's more resonant with me and a lot of the people that I come from, or we just use the term in our own native language, Kanaka Maoli or Kanaka Oiwi, which means the real people, or the real bones of that place. And so yeah, you know, I think there's a lot lost in translation when we try to apply English or colonizer terminologies to indigenous identities, and even then it's still like, what does that even mean? But it's a very loaded political identification, even just to call yourself Native American or indigenous or native. There's a lot of history and a lot of erasure that comes along with that, and it's complicated, especially when we start thinking about these things more critically. And then as a Hawaiian person, like bringing into the topic of you know, federal recognition, and yeah, that's a whole nother story. But yeah, I'll pass it on to the next person.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you going first. Yeah, I agree completely with Lehua, because as a person who is indigenous to the quote unquote United States, but I don't carry that passport because I got pushed into Canada, but I live there, I live in the US most of the time. It's a very complicated moving target, and like there's never going to be one single term for us as an umbrella group that works, simply because we're not an umbrella group. We're all individual sovereign nations that really rely on that sovereignty to be ourselves. So like Lehua said, Kanaka Oiwi, Kanaka Maoli is their term for original people. Same with us, we have Onkwe, which means the original people. And so it's our term for us that is like the most meaningful to me. And so I just want to echo everything Lehua said, because it's spot on. Part of my background is being an educator. I have a master's in education with Indigenous education as the goal. And it's all about that, answering that question of like, what is Native? What do we call you? Can we say Indian? Can we say Indigenous? Can we say First Nations? Or what do these terms mean, and why are they always changing? Just give me an answer, right? And so you hear that so much, and it's just such a 101 level topic that is like never really going to be solved, because it's ultimately impossible in my opinion, like unless you just siphon right down to the bottom of the most essential definition of the person, which is their nation, their own language. Because even like I'm Oneida, which is one of 6 nations that is often known in the States as Iroquois, but we say Iroquois. And like even within that, like that's an Algonquin word that means like the people of the snakes or something. Like, so we don't really identify with that, even though it's in a native language, it's not ours. And so it's just like the definitions and names are extremely complicated, but yeah, like just ask the person ultimately, right? Like, what do they identify as, and go with that. Like, even if it isn't going to be what you identify as, or you would choose if you were them, like ultimately, I think it's just an individual thing, because the umbrella doesn't fit. That's my 101 again. Sorry.
I don't remember if I'm next. Am I next? Okay, I'm an introvert too, so this is like, it's scary. It's complicated for me because here in the United States, Indigenous people are considered like people from the US, like they erase Indigenous people from Latin America. So, you know, when I'm filling out like the census, like what am I, right? Am I Indigenous? Am I Latino? Like, what am I? But then, you know, community, they also like, they go mostly by like the country that you're from, like are you Mexican, are you Guatemalan, Salvadorian? And within the Mexican community, there's a lot of anti-indigeneity. So we are raised to believe that we are mestizos, that we are not indigenous. We oftentimes we're encouraged to assimilate, to not speak our native language, to try to kind of just pass more as Mexican rather than Mexican indigenous. For those of us who don't live in like specific indigenous communities, who had to move and relocate to other states, and we were basically kind of told to just do that so we could survive. It's a survival mechanism, right? Because in Mexican communities, you know, indigenous people are seen as like little children, like, oh, these poor people, like little children, like they can't do anything for themselves, that they're not smart enough, that they're not capable enough, and that they'll always be like these poor, defenseless, ignorant little people, like little children, you know. And the more that you can get away from your indigeneity, the better. So for me, it's complicated. Like I am obviously indigenous, and I practice a lot of my indigenous cultural beliefs and everything, but identifying myself is difficult. Not identifying myself, but like the label itself, like Native American, and the whole concept of it, because even here we're not accepted. You know, when I used to work at an institution that had a Native American community, at the beginning, like, people don't trust you because they think you're a fake Indian. And it's like, it's so like, why are we policing our own communities? You know what I mean? Like, you know, so and so doesn't have a tribal ID, so they're not indigenous enough. Like, and this whole idea of blood quantum, like, who started that, and why are we continuing with that? And you know, if we could stop with all that division, I think we'd get farther on. And the labels sometimes stop us from like getting the actual work done. And you know, some of us don't speak the language, but you know, some of us are able to do other things. And you know, whether or not you're like, this whole qualification of whether or not you're Native enough, that's not where I feel like the discussion should go. But I feel like all the time is that division. And I get it, we're fighting because for the longest time, I mean, the fact that we're all here today, like, you know, we were almost killed off, right? And the fact that, you know, we have been able to be here speaks volumes of our resilience of the community. And that's what we should celebrate, rather than thinking about if we're Indian enough or not.
Beautifully put. I'll go next. So I grew up in rural Oklahoma, and Oklahoma has such a toxic and loaded history for Indigenous folks in here on Turtle Island. Like, you know, it was Indian territory until it wasn't. You know, they displaced it. It was like the end of the Trail of Tears. You know, if you made it there, then maybe you'd get a little piece of land, and then 20 years later, they took it all away and gave it to white people for free. So there's so many different tribes that are represented in Oklahoma as a result of that. So I never had a specifically like Choctaw upbringing, but I had so many people in my life who were one of like dozens of tribes who just happen to live in this part of the state, what have you. My grandmother was also a victim of the boarding schools, which there were a bunch in Oklahoma, and that erasure did a number on like stopping information, stopping the downflow of culture, stopping access to like ancestral knowledge. She got out of that boarding school and immediately married a white Church of Christ preacher. And you know, so it's been a lot of digging and stuff to get to the root of it all. I mean, I've always had so much support from my Native communities, just because growing up in the country, it was one of the few places I got confirmation that being an artist is okay and that you should pursue art. It's like built into the culture, you know. It's one of the most beautiful things that we pass down. So that's was the biggest support structure I had when there wasn't another one, like showing work at the Red Earth Festival in Oklahoma, and like getting to access all the different like tribal cultures that were present in such a small radius, when it should have been, you know, that many tribes over hundreds of thousands of square miles instead of just tiny little Oklahoma. Yeah, that's my lived history with it.
And I guess to follow up and wrap up on a subject I feel like we could spend hours talking on, because we're just like, we're all so passionate and have different lived experiences. For me, I resonate more with Indigenous than the term indigeneity rather than Native American, because I feel like the root in and of itself is ingrained in history and makes it seem like our people are part of history, and that it is stopped because it's written in the history books, and it's like, oh, this is one section and this is what happened. And I feel like from the way it's taught in public schools, it's like, okay, these were our people and our people went on this journey and the end. And then it's like, okay, everyone still thinks that a lot of white people are like, oh, that's it, like indigeneity stopped there. And so for me, it's been not struggling with, but combating and being like, okay, like what does indigeneity mean to me? How am I like rooted in this in my ancestors? Because if you have not been out to Eastern Tennessee or Eastern Kentucky, everyone loves to say that their grandmother was a Cherokee princess, and you're like, oh, can we pump the brakes? And you're like, cool, like, let's debrief, because there's no princess. And what do you do to like honor your ancestors and celebrate your indigeneity? Because I don't want it to ever come off as a blood quantum thing, but what are you doing to honor your ancestors? And even though like I didn't grow up on a res, how are we going back and finding the patterns and honoring what our ancestors have gone before us that has gone through the erasure, and how can we help kind of bring it back in a way of honoring and reviving some of the history without it seeing like, okay, this was a time period, instead of we are people, and we are regrowing and having a resurgence. So that's why I feel like indigeneity is just so much more significant for me. And for a lot of my friends, just because Native American feels so white colonizer history book of this is what happened, here's what happened, neat little bow, instead of how our people are thriving displaced, and how are we connecting with our ancestors, and what does this look like, and how do we root in our indigeneity, and how do we honor all people within that identity group, because it's huge, it's an umbrella term, and like you all have said before, labels so many people into a collective that really are so niche. But how do we honor that without it being combative within our group? Because it's like you want to make sure you're safe, but at like what cost? Because you're like, okay, am I harming someone else? And yeah, so much, but I'll stop there.
Thank you all so much. I am learning a lot, and I really appreciate y'all's insights and y'all's willingness to share. So thank you. Alrighty, so building off of that, how do your identities and lived experiences show up and or inform your art? And then the second part of that question, oh wait, where'd the chat go? Okay, here we go. The second part of that question is, could you speak more about how your practice informs your art and advocacy? So you can answer both, one, whatever makes sense for you.
You're going in the circle again. Let me pull up the chat, because that's a very good question. Okay, so identities and lived experiences. I mean, like, the work I make is mine, and also Native Hawaiian, because I'm Native Hawaiian and I'm the one making it, right? And just a little bit about my background. Not only am I Kanaka Maoli, but I'm also Okinawan and Japanese, and also on my mom's side, she's adopted and she's white, and who knows what might be in that mix as well, but that's how she identifies, and that's how that was passed on to me. And so there's a lot there to kind of unpack and learn about myself as I'm creating work, and it's definitely like a touch and go kind of thing. But I was raised by my grandparents back home in Hawaii. I went to a Native Hawaiian school, and so Native Hawaiian is you know, what I think informs most of what I do. And cultural knowledge in terms of like the languages that I speak, it's Native Hawaiian and Japanese and English, of course. And so there's little bits and pieces of all these different backgrounds that inform my work, like the piece that's behind me right now as my background. It's like a traditionally Native Hawaiian and Japanese pattern, and within that are patterns from both of these cultures that I am part of, across very huge expanses of oceans. And so I think a lot of my work is informed by being part of the Native Hawaiian diaspora, and being from many, many different kinds of communities and stories, and trying to piece together my past so that I don't feel like I'm all these little pieces. I'm a whole person. And beyond that, I think like I mentioned earlier, the practice of making kapa, the bark cloth, bringing that into my family so that my, descendants and their ancestors are part of a continuum of something, not something that was broken up in time. Like for me, I'm the first kapa maker in my family line in 7 or 8 generations. And I don't have a wealth of knowledge from my own family to pull from within this practice, where at one point in time, it was, like buckskin tanning. It was just something that you learned at home and passed on to your children. And I want my kids and their grandkids to have more than I did growing up. And I think that's a huge reason why I do what I do. And building off of that, regarding my queerness, it was growing up in a very conservative Christian household. That was just something that you didn't talk about, and something that was highly stigmatized. And there were a lot of harmful opinions, unfortunately, in my family and even in my community about what it means to be queer or part of the LGBTQ plus umbrella, or in our language, we call it mahu. And that's how I identify, as someone who's kind of in the middle or fluid between presentations of masculine and feminine forms and energies. And so that's, our traditional non-binary gender term. And I think, that definitely plays into the work that I create, because as a kapa maker, not only do I make the cloth itself, but I also make the tools. One part of the task was specifically reserved for gendered women. The other half was reserved for gendered men. And some people these days do both, who aren't non-binary, who just identify as cisgender. And for myself, though, I think it's very important for me to intentionally approach those parts of the process, because I'm playing out something that Mahu back in the day would have been able to do as well. And so now, here in a post-colonial world where we're trying to figure out where we as queer Native people lie at all these different intersections, I think that's something that I need to approach very intentionally and coherently. And when I am able to bring pieces like that talk about being Mahu into large spaces, like I just did a show at the Portland Art Museum in Oregon. There was a school group who came in, I think of like 5th graders or 6th graders, somewhere around there. And a couple students who came to the show were Polynesian, and they knew the term Mahu. And they saw this work and they felt so seen, because they themselves identify as queer. And just to be able to not only be Native Hawaiian, but also represent what it means to be queer and non-binary in these spaces that traditionally were not made by or for Brown and Black people, was something that was just so powerful, because I didn't have that growing up. And for me, that wasn't really all that long ago, like I'm in my late 20s, and hearing kids who are like 12, 13, feeling so seen and so supported, they have more than I had growing up. And that's the most I can do, So the galleries and the exhibitions and travel across the world, like that's super dope. But I think what has a more deeper and long-term impact for me is the ability to give back in ways that I didn't necessarily have as a kid. So.
Wow, that's so awesome. I just want to echo everything you said, because like it really rang true for me. So very similarly, Native people, often our identities are tied to reservations, which people think are traditional, but they are not. They are extremely artificial. We lived pre-contact in like these networks that moved around with seasons and with changing elements, and like with caretaking for all the land, it wasn't an untouched wilderness. It was a wonderfully relational space that we maintained and, you know, cared for as the seasons passed. And yes, of course there were conflicts, but that happens everywhere. But it was not the Wild West or whatever they want to say that we lived in. And so again, like I grew up constantly moving around. I've never lived anywhere for more than 7 years at a time, I think. And so I've bounced around the world and lived away from my reserve for most of my life. I've never lived on my reserve. And even now I'm in my parents' house. I don't decorate like this. I'm up here on my homelands for the first time in like a long time because of COVID. But because it's so rejuvenating to be home, and I just keep saying, oh, I'll go back next week, I'll go back next week. And I've been here for like 4 months. And so it's just, yeah, again, so I've had to learn. I married another Indigenous person, and so I had to learn how to sort of walk softly on other Indigenous lands. And while I live in diaspora, like you mentioned, I spent time in Hawaii, and I learned Kappa. It was wonderful. It was incredible. And like learning to like be an Indigenous person who isn't like, technically maybe you are a settler, but briefly on other native lands, and to learn how to approach like other Indigenous communities for their knowledge and to share space, and like just feel that community and like what you have in common has been just an absolute wonderful joy and blessing to me, because of how it's informed my understanding of my place in the world and my art practice. Especially, I've learned so many things in various Indigenous places around the world, from the very North Pole to like Mauna Kea and like all over. It's just been wonderful. So I'm very grateful for those times that I've spent elsewhere, which has really informed how I approach my own work and my own relationality to where I'm from. So yeah, it's been complicated but good. Again, like you mentioned with like Two-Spirit, like that sort of thing with hide tanning, it's just like those roles that were not necessarily as gender segregated as we might think. They're very blended, and it's an extremely welcoming space to learn how to hide tan and how to sort of take on these roles that might be currently seen as very masculine, feminine. Like even beading used to be non-gendered previously, like, and now you see sort of male beaders getting a lot of recognition. Oh, so brave doing a woman's craft, but it's not. It's a craft for everyone. And so I think sort of dismantling these superimposed colonial understandings of what our practices actually are has been really encouraging and rejuvenating. And again, like you mentioned with the youth, like I'm in my 30s, and when I was a teenager, like it wasn't cool to be Native, but now we have like res dogs in Oklahoma and like all this sort of representation that is fun and exciting and cool. Like the coolness of it, I can't understate, because like it's so different to be, I call myself like an elder youth, but like in this world, walking around and seeing like the renaissance happening in the Indigenous art world. And even though I'm still sort of a baby artist just emerging, it's wonderful to see and take part in. So yeah, Yako.
I guess for me, one thing I didn't mention to all of you is that I teach at a high school, at a dual language school. And a lot of the students that I teach are Spanish speakers, but we do have a population of Indigenous Latinos there. And I've been very intentional about recreating curriculum and decolonizing even the classroom, because gosh, just the traditional way that they teach here in the classrooms is so not the way our people learn. So I've changed the seating, I've changed the way the classroom looks, and I've been very intentional about having authentic pieces from our community, especially Indigenous communities. And I don't know if it's because they just trust me, or I don't know what, but no one's questioned my curriculum so far. But I've been intentional about teaching about anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, because you know what, like, unfortunately, the K-12 system really kind of you know, they I can't think of the word in English, but they just brush through like the entire history of our people. And like y'all mentioned, like, we're just a little blurb on a textbook. So I've had to recreate all of that and talk about, you know, even the case system, and how Afro-Latinos were not even in the census, and Afro-Mexicans were not in the census like until like very recently, and the deportations of Black people, Indigenous people too, and how does that affect us, and how does our collective experience also you know, inform us. And it's been, I feel like sometimes like I'm talking to the wall. Like I think a lot of youth, like, you know, they're so absorbed into technology and their cell phones and video games and everything, and sometimes I don't think this is important. But then, you know, they and I tell them, like, when you go out there, because right now you, like, the people you're surrounded with are your people. But when you leave like this small community that's very diverse in Iowa and go into the reality of what is the entire state of Iowa, it's going to really hit you, you know? And so a lot of students do come back, and they, you know, they remember all the things that I taught them. And we discuss how Indigenous artists in our country are not valued, and how people here in the United States will go down there and they will haggle and, you know, try to lower the prices. And like, well, you don't do that when you go buy your Gucci purse. You don't do that at Walmart, but why are you doing that to Indigenous artists? So you know, I use every moment that I can based on my lived experiences, my identity, but also to honor my community and the students that I serve. The fact that, you know, there's students that had never heard their history, students that don't know, oh my gosh, like, we're alive today, but we had a civil war in our country in Guatemala, and they were murdering all the Indigenous people. Or we talk about birth control and how you know, they sterilized women, Indigenous women, and, you know, what does that mean, and how does that how are we allowing some of these things to continue to happen today? So that's the way my identity and my experiences show up. You know, I've learned a lot of the elders are dying in my family. So I've been very intentional now of going back to my hometown in Mexico and really sitting down with the elders and documenting our history and their lived experiences, because those stories, if we don't hear them again, they're not going to be told. And I'm trying to write the history of our family down. And you know, I can't do it if our elders aren't here anymore. So I have notebooks and notebooks of just writings and recordings and stuff. And I'm excited to see where this this writing, sorry guys that I talk a lot. I'm excited to see where, like, what happens with this writing, because I think it's time now that our people, our stories get told, and they get told authentically by us and not by someone who didn't live this.
That's beautiful. I love getting back to your the elders in your family. I have to reread this real quick. My art practice is very autobiographical. I feel kind of that's built into the medium of photography a little bit. I also use art making as like a therapy tool. So if I'm working through something, it'll usually like manifest itself in ritual or process that happens to end up as art. About 8 years ago, my husband and I were both diagnosed with AIDS. He passed away about 7 months after our diagnosis. So I didn't even know it was, I was making work at the time. is my default since birth to work through things with art or the art making practice or affecting my environment in some way, shape, or form. So I really don't set out to make a body of work like a lot of conceptual artists do. My life happens and then I have to make art about it, and then that's how the story gets told. And so, I'll have like a photograph, but there's probably like 4 pages of backstory that goes into like the making of the work before it even like came to fruition. I just had a show here at the house. I made this body of work during the pandemic because I live like in a cabin out in the mountains, surrounded by forest and no people to be seen. So during the pandemic, as somebody who has a very, very compromised immune system, I didn't have the T cells to be gambling in town in rural Tennessee. So I holed up and I made art. And while I was here in our cabin that we shared together, he started showing back up again and being present. And then I started making work, and then the work turns into a conversation with your husband, who happens to be a ghost at this point in the stage of your relationship. And so when it came time to show the work, the idea of it was still the pandemic. The idea of showing it in a gallery was just abhorrent to me, because I didn't want to go into a space where you have to like talk to people and huff everybody's air and stuff and whatever flu they happen to have at the time. So I started growing this like 7,000 square foot flower and native grass planting here at the house. And then all of the work I had printed on this outdoor fabric that I hung around this massive garden that I planted. And then everybody was able to come out and hang out and look at art in the mountains and watch the butterflies and see how the clouds roll through. I think that was probably the best way to view that work. I also live in like one of the largest intentional rural queer communities in the United States. So I have access to all of these amazing queer folks who live out here. I'm exposed to some of the most progressive ideology in the US, in rural ass Tennessee. So I'm very grateful for them. And they obviously inform all of my work. And for the last probably like 12 years, anybody in the neighborhood who participates in sex work, I've offered that of my photo skills. I have this superpower. I don't have money to give folks, but I do have this like superpower where I can make people look very fancy and very well done and very expensive. So this is a project I've been working on for forever, and I didn't think of it as a project until a year or two ago, and I started compiling it all, and there was so much work. But yeah, so like being able to like do that for folks in my community to like make more money, like raise their station, their financial ability to make money, bring money back into the community. That's one of the ways that my community informs what I do and when.
I'm just in awe. Like, how do I follow? I'm like, one, your art exhibit sounds phenomenal, beautiful, and like you took us there with words. And thank you for letting us be a part of that. But my identities and lived experiences, just like a culmination of everyone. It's like what we go through is kind of like what our medium tends to be. And it's like, okay, what's prominent? What are we going through? What am I working through? And so for me, that's been like, how does my identity, both as like a queer, gender nonconforming, Indigenous woman, and like my recent like health diagnoses and mental health like diagnoses, how does that all play together? And so that's been a lot of like for me working with like different modalities and different mediums of art, but then also coming back to a recent development to go like more into the second question of I'm now in a long-term relationship with my partner of like 2.5 years, me long-term. I'm like, ooh, long-term, who's trans. And so we do a lot of knitting and crocheting together. And he thought of the beautiful idea of, he's like, have you ever made a packer for trans men? And I was like, no. And so what does that look like? And then beanies to express like different flags and different like access to like just representation, because growing up in a Christian household, like I was not allowed to experience that, was not allowed to like have queer joy and have like the knowledge of knowing myself. And so it's like, okay, like how can I help make this and have this representation and have this joy in myself, but then also offer it to others of like, okay, like maybe you're going through things and you're learning about yourself. So this beanie means a lot to you, or what does this look like? And then from Packers, we've started brainstorming on what different types of underwear and binders can look like for trans women and trans men and non-binary folks, and very much pulling together his identities and then my identity of being queer and this art maker of like, okay, how can we help others feel comfortable in their bodies and comfortable in their lived experiences, and how can we help make this? And so I don't see it more as like oh, like this is my project and this is what I'm doing. It's like, this is how my heart can love others, and this is how my like ancestors have prepared me for this and helped like grow me into this, because I feel like if I wasn't raised around like a sewing machine and needles and learning how to do all these things, like it would have been lost. Like I never would have picked that up. And so my queerness informs a lot of what I do and a lot of who I am, and growing into that into my late 20s, I think I'm making up for lost time and not living my truth and having that opportunity to. So how can I continue I'd say me like a DVD player times 2. Like, how can I speed this up? What can I do? Can I be doing more and living in that and having that surrounding me?
Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed like learning more about you all and y'all's experiences and how that shows up and informs your art. It's lovely. To be respectful of your time, we are going to go ahead and end here. However, if you all want to exchange contact information or social media handles, it's a great time to do that if you would like to stay in touch. If not, no pressure. And if you have anything you want to plug, any projects, any movements, causes, anything that you want to plug, this is also a good time to do that. And you can unmute or you can put it in the chat.
I just want to thank everyone. It was just really wonderful. I wanted to pipe in and like ask questions like while you guys were talking, but it was wonderful. So thank you so much.